the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings, Biden in Europe, and Ukrainian refugees. I'm Adam Bearne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Bearne. Joining us today is Libertarian and Young Voices contributor, Regan Farrell. Hi, Regan. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, Adam?
I'm good. Our first time our paths have crossed here, so welcome. We also have conservative independent journalist, Peter Pischke. Peter, good to see you again.
Howdy, howdy.
And of course, we also have progressive Edwith Theogene of the Center for American Progress. Hi, Edwith.
Hi.
Well, let's get right into it this week, folks, because federal judge and Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson went before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Here's the story from CBS News.
That, to me, is Exhibit A of activism.
On the second day of questioning, some Republicans turned up the heat, continuing to press Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson on whether she was too lenient in sentencing child pornography defendants.
Any of these wait a minute, Judge. You think it is a bigger deterrent to take somebody who's on a computer looking at sexual images of children in the most disgusting way is to supervise their computer habits versus putting them in jail?
No, Senator, I didn't say versus.
That's exactly what you said.
And divisions among senators spilled over.
No one case can stand in for a judge's entire record.
Okay, but I'm discussing every one of the cases. So if you're not going to explain it...
Senator, would you please let her respond?
No, not if she's not going to answer my question.
There were multiple clashes on the committee.
Your nomination turned out to be a testing ground for conspiracy theories and culture war theories.
So Edwith Theogene, Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first African-American woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court. Did the nomination hearing live up to the historic occasion?
I believe so. I mean, it's been really exciting for her to even be nominated, and the process during her whole confirmation has been really interesting to see. I personally enjoyed watching Senator Cory Booker, the way that, he speaks about her and her family. It's been definitely something empowering in terms of diversity. During her confirmation this whole week, Judge Jackson has demonstrated that she is unequivocally qualified for the Supreme Court. She's shown incredible grace under pressure over more than 20 hours of questioning by members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's a really long, intense job interview, right? And people are getting more and more frustrated, just even doing an interview that's like a couple of hours and multiple days. So this is an intense process. And throughout this whole process, she's thoughtfully and thoroughly answered questions, demonstrated the depth and breadth of her decade of experiences across the legal system, and she's masterfully explained the law in her answers, underscoring her commitment to transparency in her decision-making, and also demonstrating her true love of the law. So I haven't gone to law school. I definitely was interested in it at some point. Some of the people who've been doing some of her questioning have gone to law school. Some of them have gone to the greatest ones. Some of them have gone to bad ones, but she has sat there and really explained how the law works, how governance works, what her role is, how she sees it in such a thoughtful, graceful manner, especially when some of the committee members have tried to mischaracterize her record and views and have been combative in their questioning, bringing out charts, big ones, small ones. But she's shown so much poise and temperament required for Supreme Court justice. The attacks on her sentencing record have been discredited by fact checkers from the major news outlets, including the Associated Press, New York Times, and the National Review. The greater majority of the judge's sentences for child pornography offenders were at or above level recommended by the U.S. Probation Office, and they were in line with other federal judges. They've been definitely attacking her record of how she has administered the law, and she's definitely come back to defend herself in that regard. So, I could go on and on about this, but I know we're going to get more into this. But yes, I'm really excited, and this is definitely a historic moment.
You definitely sound like a fan, and perhaps your dog is as well there in the background, barking away in agreement. Peter Pischke, how did you see Ketanji Brown Jackson's performance in the nomination hearings?
For her specifically, I think for the most part, she did a pretty solid job. She handled things as they were sent to her pretty professionally. As a conservative, there are probably a few areas that were a little, I don't know if disconcerting is quite the right word, but you're like, come on. I think when they were asking her to give a definition of a woman and she decided that she wasn't going to engage in that, that was like, come on, you just say it. Come on, stop playing games. But I mean, otherwise, I think she handled things pretty well. I think the questions from Senator Josh Hawley about the child pornography sentencing, they were pretty disingenuous, if we're being honest. He understood that what the case was specifically about kids. The majority of people who are in those situations, so who are strictly child pornography users, are teenagers. And this is an expert. One thing that I do like about Ketanji is her expert in sentencing guidelines and following that so many years. If you had to say you had to pick an expertise she has, that's one she does. So it was all a little bit silly. I think it was handled pretty well. This wasn't like we saw with Kavanaugh or with Coney Barrett, where things got really silly to the point where inside and outside the proceedings for the nomination got a little bit on the crazy side. But on all honesty, I think she handled this well. I think some of the cues to textualism and originalism that she used in her answers is a positive sign. But the left still seems to be pretty firm that she will be a vote that they can rely on to vote liberally. So I'm not totally sure what to make of that. But all in all, I think it's interesting. I just don't think that many people are paying attention to the hearings this week. But all in all, I thought it was okay.
Regan Farrell, I see you nodding along to much of that. What did you think as you were watching the hearings?
I agree. In my opinion, judicial nominations have largely turned into kabuki theater. And Ketanji as a Judge Jackson is likely the best that the Republicans are going to get from a Democrat nominee. So what they're using this nomination as an excuse to do is relitigate the last nominations of Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett. Similar to what Peter said, Judge Jackson takes a lot of her judicial philosophy. Her judicial philosophy is very similar to Amy Coney Barrett. She believes in textualism in statutory interpretations and originalism when it comes to the Constitution. And I'm actually really excited about Judge Jackson's grace under pressure, like Edwith said, and her experience representing criminal defendants, because the last justice with criminal defense experience was actually Thurgood Marshall, who left the bench in 1991.
Thank you all very much for that. And let's move on to, as Edwith brought up, something that perhaps is more in the forefront of most Americans' minds in the news, and that is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because this week, President Biden is in Europe for a series of summits to discuss the situation there. And here's some coverage from NBC News.
President Biden and world leaders kicking off an emergency NATO summit in Brussels today, aiming to show a united front against Vladimir Putin and his war in Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky delivering a virtual address behind closed doors earlier this morning. Again, pleading for more military support to combat the Russian onslaught. The Biden administration aiming to harness global outrage against Russia, officially accusing Russian forces of committing war crimes in Ukraine.
So, Peter Pischke, is this President Biden leading on the world stage as he promised he would take back America back to?
I'll give President Biden credit. The last month of his foreign policy has been some of his best performance as president so far. And I'm not a fan of what he's done, but he's handled this pretty competently. How much is President Biden? How much is NATO at large? I mean, that's going to take historians to figure out. Part of the issue facing Biden, the reason why he had to go over to Europe is that there are issues with NATO. For example, part of the problem is while we have really strict sanctions, Germany and the EU at large have not targeted hardly any of those at the energy issue and are still buying the majority of their oil from Russia, which is people have described Putin's Russia as basically a gas station with a nuclear weapon. It's just like, that's a major thing. And then there have been, whispers, and you see it in think pieces here and there saying, well, maybe the best thing to happen here is if the Ukraine comes to talk to Russia and then they give up the Donetsk. I'm not pronouncing my Russian names correctly there. And some of the territory Putin's taken, and maybe that would be the best thing. So Putin has to go over there and he has to try to convince the leaders that what's happening here is that we might have to put up a front that's not just going to last a month or a year, but potentially a decade or more. And who knows what's going to happen, but that is one of the things on the table, and it's unsure if they can get NATO to hold to that. There are good signs. Biden would like Russia to be officially taken on the G20. At this point, it's already kind of a done deal. Russia's already said, if you're going to buy our stuff, buy them in rubles. So that's kind of already happening. But I mean, I think Biden's handling it a lot better than probably would have guessed he would have just a few months ago. It is a scary time. There are more and more reports of experts saying that it's very possible. And this is by the way, this is part of the conference and why they were speaking, was that Russia will use an unconventional weapon, which means it not just nuclear, but also biological. That is a bit of a scary factor. So I'm kind of glad with a lot of things that are happening, but we are still in the woods and we're probably just at the beginning of this thing. So we'll have to see what happens.
And Edwith Theogene, Peter alludes to another piece of news that the president made when he said that if Russia were to use chemical weapons, that the United States and NATO would respond in kind. He didn't elaborate on what that meant. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I kind of agree with the point that Peter made, that it's scary. And it's hard to, it's just like a scary future for us to think about. I think overall, though, the Biden administration's response to the crisis has been incredibly strong. I've said that before. And I think the Biden administration will continue to show up as things are needed. So I'm not sure what the response will be. I don't have any sort of intel for that. But it is a scary thing to think that the situation can continue to escalate. What I am happy about is that while Biden has been convening different global partners and states and stuff like that, he also has announced that the U.S. is going to accept up to 100,000 refugees who are fleeing war from Ukraine. So I'm excited that they will be provided the full range of legal pathways available to them to come to the United States. And also, the United States has been providing tons of resources and support to Ukraine. So I think that's a great thing that's happening. So it's scary for sure, though.
Okay, and spoiler alert, we may be talking about that refugee announcement shortly. But Regan, how do you see the president's trip so far and what you've heard from him?
I think he's in line with what you should be expecting from your president. Today, as we're recording, marks 1 month since the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's looking like it will be a really long haul, and this commitment to NATO re-strengthening our commitments to our allies and agreeing to more assistance for Ukraine in the form of humanitarian aid, accepting refugees. That's entirely what I would expect, and I'm just glad that it's happening now. I do wonder how much these actions will, in aggregate, cause Russia to take action in Eastern Europe. I think Secretary of State Blinken declaring that Russia's committing war crimes is one of these. Biden convening with NATO, sending more assistance. The entire thing with the F-16s a few weeks ago. Peace, they don't seem like a lot, but in aggregate, it could aggravate Russia into some sort of action. I'm just hoping that it doesn't cause a World War III. One of the key points from Biden's press release was saying that in regards to China, that they understand that their economic future is with the West and that they're more closely aligned with the West than Russia. And so I do think that that's hopeful as well.
Yes, and certainly horrifying reports coming out of the city of Mariupol definitely encourage any of our viewers or listeners to check out the Associated Press report from the journalists who were there and who just escaped this week. But our guests have set us up nicely for our final topic, because President Biden announced from Europe on Thursday that the United States will accept 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Here's the president.
Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we've also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families.
So, Regan Farrell, 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Do you see that as the right move, or is there potentially some issues with that for you?
I see that as the right move, and I would have preferred to see it a few weeks earlier, if not accepting more refugees. My hometown of Cleveland, Ohio is actually poised to accept a lot of the Ukrainian refugees. They currently have Cleveland has the highest percentage of Ukrainians in the United States. And refugees and immigrants revitalize much of the Rust Belt where I'm from. I think something that is interesting to note is that we're accepting 100,000 refugees from Ukraine, but we only accepted tens of thousands of Afghan refugees after our disastrous pullout of Afghanistan after 20 years of involvement there. And I think it speaks to our ties with the EU and our own inability to address our mistakes.
Edwith, how do you feel about President Biden's announcement?
I have some mixed feelings. I think it's really great that we are providing that space and opportunity for Ukrainian refugees. I mean, they are in war. You know, this is a dangerous time, and I think it is really great that we are meeting this moment. And I agree with Regan that I wish this would have happened sooner. But on a broader scale, it also makes me rethink about our immigration system as a whole. There are plenty of other countries that are experiencing war or economic insecurity and all different kinds of things that the United States has played a hand on. Afghanistan is a great example, but there's also tons of other countries. And we either have suspended taking in refugees or folks from those countries, or have very limited numbers of people that are allowed to come to the United States, or they also have very challenging opportunities of legal pathway. So I think it just makes me really think, like, why are we prioritizing Ukraine when there are tons of other countries of people who need refuge and would like to come to the United States or need to come to the United States, and they don't have those opportunities. And I don't want to deny that maybe race is playing a factor in this as well. That has been something that has been part of discourse that I've seen around as well. And I'm also speaking from the experience of, like, my family's from Haiti. And there's always been a huge conversation around the Black immigrant experience here in the United States. So that is something that is also top of mind for me.
Peter Pischke.
The refugee thing, in some ways, yeah, I think the bringing in the 100,000 refugees is probably warranted. I think the $1 billion in additional donation to what we've already given, probably pretty good. The problem is you have to look at context, and things are really bad. They haven't been this bad. We haven't this kind of situation in Europe since 1945. In many ways, this has looked like it will dwarf what we had just a few years ago. We had a huge amount of people coming from the Middle East and Africa into Europe. We're not totally sure on the numbers, but based on what reports I've read from places like the New York Times, the Associated Press, the work of like the UN that's done, they think there may be as many as 10 to 12 million people that have fled. Now, does that make them official refugee status? We don't know, but we do know in Poland alone, there's 2 million refugees, and it's looked like it's going to be doubling that by the end of this year. We know that this could get significantly worse when you have a fourth the population of the Ukraine that has had to flee their homes, and where are they going to go? That is a major problem. And Poland, of course, has problems of their own, and they're getting a little nervous. So in that context, us taking in 100,000, while it's nice, it isn't that many. We take in quite a few people in this country, both volitionally and not. And 100,000 in that context isn't all that many. Now, I am in favor of that. In general, I sometimes on immigration issues, I might have some pushback than to the other panelists here. But when it comes to something where you have the refugees, they come from an area, and these people have made it very clear they want to live in a classic liberal society. They want freedom. I say let them in, especially if we've given some kind of order or agreement that we were going to have their backs. The very least we can do is to try to keep our word and to help them out there. So, what happened in Afghanistan is abhorrent on so many levels. It's hard to stomach, honestly.
Let's move on, shall we, to take some questions then from our viewers and our listeners. And we'll start with one from Susie Simmons, who's going back to our first topic. And Susie asks, is there anything in KBJ, so I guess Judge Jackson gets her own cool acronym now, is there anything in KBJ's record or revealed at the hearings that genuinely worries legal conservatives? Peter Pischke, we should probably start with you on that one, I guess.
Okay, that's the kind of the issue here, and maybe I alluded to my answer earlier. So on paper, she seems awesome in so many ways. The problem is she has ties and support from certain groups that are the most progressive of progressive, like the Campaign for Justice, which a whole bunch of Biden people came out of that outfit. And it's like they are very comfortable with KBJ, that they feel she's going to be a reliable vote for when very progressive or liberal issues come out. And I'm assuming they have more information about her than we do. And so that does make me a little hesitant.
Edwith, Peter seemed to be hinting at some sort of nefarious undercurrent to this appointment.
Spooky.
It just makes me ask, I wonder for Peter, if it was a conservative judge who had that same endorsement, would his concern still exist? Or I guess the thing is, like, who endorses the judge? Like, she's also been endorsed by tons of police officers, military people, and different legal folks, which also make liberals a little concerned. And I think just because she has these endorsements from all sides of the law, I actually think it's a great thing, whether they're super progressive or conservative. But the whole thing is that, like, as a judge, you are impartial, you are objective, you are weighing and measuring the law, and following the guidance of the Constitution and interpreting it and doing all those things. Like, you're not supposed to be technically a political person in that way.
Regan Farrell, can we just go back to Susie Simmons' original point, where she seems to be hinting that, asking if anything was revealed in the hearings, that there was no big surprises here, were there?
No, I don't think there were any big surprises, and it's difficult to discern where exactly she'll lie, what fault lines she'll have once she's on the bench. But like with Peter, I think she'll be just fine, and that conservatives will be surprised on some of her decisions.
Okay, well, let's go to our next question then. It comes from Walter Gomez, and we talked about refugees from Ukraine versus Afghanistan a lot, but Walter's asking, is it racist to accept refugees from Ukraine while denying refuge and asylum to people from Central America and the Caribbean, or the Caribbean if you're American? Regan, do you want to start us on that one?
I think that you're seeing racial divides, certainly. You're hearing stories from Europe about Black refugees being moved to the back of the line in favor of white Ukrainians. I think, like when we spoke about Afghanistan, that's largely based off of either religious or racial divides. And I think that it's easier for us to separate Central Americans and Latin Americans from white Europeans. So yes, I think that a lot of our immigration is based off of racial bias.
Peter Pischke, racial bias in the immigration system.
Like for us, or for like in general? Because like in parts of Europe, for sure, that
in the United, I think it's the United States specifically is what Walter Gomez is asking.
I don't know, that you're taking in some intent. I don't know if it goes that far, because that's like too much thinking for them. It's like, why didn't we take in the people of Hong Kong? Was that racial based that we weren't taking them because they're Asian? I don't really think that's part of the calculations. I think they look at, can we take these people in and will it benefit my career to do so? I don't think it's a question of asking about, well, what's their racial preference? Now, does that mean racism doesn't exist, or there aren't people who probably are biased in that favor? No, I just don't think the leaders at large are making their calculations that way. Europe, totally. I mean, as the other panelists mentioned, I mean, there are many news reports of Ukrainian people who are leaving but happen to be Black, and they aren't allowed to pass through, whereas in their fellow travelers, their white fellow travelers are. But in the U.S. specifically, I don't know. It could be, potentially, but I would need more evidence to prove definitively.
Edwith, Peter seems to be suggesting that it's political expediency to take in Ukrainian refugees, the center of the attention of the world at the moment, yet leaving Trump-era restrictions on people coming from south of the U.S. border.
So before, my answer was going to be totally different until Peter spoke, honestly. But I do think there's racial bias that plays into our immigration system. But I also do think that it is a political choice on who different leaders choose to support and accept. But that is also reflective, I think, of the larger racial bias within the world itself. I think there is, like I said earlier, it is concerning to me that there are countries in South America that have also been at war, who've also experienced tons of community violence and invasions and all different kinds of things. And some of them the United States has played a role in. And yet the numbers that we have, or the pathways to citizenship for folks, have been super limited. And you have to wonder why. Recently, a couple months ago, we saw the pictures come from the border of different Haitian migrants coming into the country and how they were being mistreated and mishandled. And it was in public news, and it was huge. And it really forced the hand of Biden to create some sort of response around that. So I do think there's a level of political expedience that's at play here. But I also think that is connected and reflective to the larger racial bias that exists in the world.
Okay, well, thank you all for your response to those questions. And let's move on now to our most underreported story of the week from all of our guests here. Usually I would say who wants to go first, but Regan, it's our first time crossing paths. Why don't you give us your most underreported story this week?
Sure. It's not necessarily underreported, but I did want to bring it up, is the detention of Brittany Griner in Russia and her potentially being used as leverage in response to Western sanctions. And I believe that if this were another person with similar stature, Megan Rapinoe or Michael Phelps, that there would be greater outrage around this. And so I would like to reiterate that she is being detained. She has been arrested for what amounts to some vape cartridges, despite Russian media saying that it's heavy narcotics. And going back to what we were saying about refugees, I think largely this is based off of her race, that she's lesbian, and that she's more of a masculine build. And again, if this were someone else with the same accolades and awards, that there would be more outrage over her being held in Russia.
Okay, and for our viewers or listeners who might not know who she is, this is the WNBA star who has been detained in Russia, ostensibly on drug charges, whether we believe that or not. Peter Pischke, what's your most underreported story this week?
Okay, well, I came in today with a happy story. I love following huge tech and health innovations. Those always bring me a lot of hope for the future of humanity. It's like something is going right. There's this amazing story that came out because there have been a lot of experiments to use implantable tech, especially with diodes, to try to help people who are completely paralyzed, totally paralyzed, or have very heavy brain injuries, and to help them be able to communicate. And there's this amazing case where they were able to help this man who was completely paralyzed. He didn't even have the ability to move his eyelids. I mean, this used to be something you could never fathom would be possible. So it's a complete miracle what's happened. The scientists have been able to get this guy to communicate. They implanted some diodes and some very advanced tech into his brain. And look, the tech is slow. He can only type back to them a character a minute is what I read. And maybe they meant a word a minute, but that's what's said in the article. But it's an amazing thing. This guy could not communicate at all since 2019. And here he is, and he can talk to the world. And the first thing he says, I really enjoyed that. This is from Yahoo News. Here's the headline. I want a beer. Paralyzed man communicates first words in months using brain implant.
I think many of us can probably relate to that, but that's a fantastic medical advancement, certainly. Thank you for bringing us the news on that. Edwith Theogene, why don't you bring us home this week with your most underreported story of the week?
Sure. As we've talked about before on the show, we are waiting for a SCOTUS decision to come out that could undermine Roe v. Wade. And also tons of states have restricted access to abortion. So this story is about a bank called Citigroup, which I think a lot of people know about, one of the largest financial institutions in the United States, has begun offering to pay for travel expenses for employees to travel out of state to get access to reproductive health care. So I think that's really awesome to see businesses and especially a financial institution coming out to support its staff so that they can be able to get the care that they need. It is a scary time in terms of exercising bodily autonomy. So it's great news for me to see that someone is stepping up.
Okay, and I guess we'll be watching here to see if that becomes a trend. But that is all we have time for. Thank you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. If you have been, please subscribe to our channel and like this video, or give it a 5-star review on your podcast platform. I'm Adam Bearne. We'll see you next week.